Speaking of the Eagles, Christian, we asked you to sort of look at just some of the issues that is going on over at this place. And look, we know that they have had injury troubles. We know that their list is aging. We know that they've had to top up at various stages throughout the last couple of years in terms of their list profile. And they've had weeks where they've had basically 26, 25 players to choose from their entire squad. But they are severely hampered by injury.
Yeah, and it can't be understated. So we look at injury costs. So how many games you've lost to your best 22 players. Again, using best 22 by rating points, position played and things like that. So everyone has the best ruckman going into their team, etc., etc. Up until round 10, so the first 10 rounds of this year, they've lost 321 games to their best 22 players. And the next most is 318 was the most for Gold Coast in 2015. But then you've got West Coast 2022 at 258 as the third most. So it's 2 years in a row that they've been in the top three. And this is both at round 10.
Yeah. So my thoughts initially, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, is the Eagles possibly went 1 year too long trying to continue the hunt for a premiership. You looked at the list profile. I think we talked, maybe it might have been last year, and we looked at and
it's very easy
10 of the top 12 players were probably 30, 31 and over.
Yep.
And injury prone. You look at some of the names that are on the injury list week to week. It's Elliot Yeo. It's Luke Shuey constantly. It's Nick Naitanui. It's
Dom Sheed's
been underdone sometimes.
Tim Kelly's had
Gaff hasn't been the player he has been. So the senior players have been either not on the field or have been out of form. I mean, you look at Andrew Gaff's performances before the Andrew Brayshaw incident, for example, where he was, All-Australian, had to miss the flag year that year. He's just not been the same player since.
No.
And so this is a club that has, tried to go one more year when they thought they could continue to press. Josh Kennedy's not there anymore. Darling has been the player he has been. And it's just kind of that's been a house of cards, a bit of a Jenga. You've pulled out one too many of these Jenga blocks and the whole thing's fallen down.
Yeah, and you've hit the nail on the head, because the fact that and you can understand them wanting to kind of go, they won a premiership with the majority of this group.
List,
so it's like, well, let's keep these bones together and go for it again. The problem is, as you say, you go from 27, 28, 29, 30, and now you're at the point where they are injury-prone players. They don't have the currency that they had a few years ago, and now what do you do? What do you do? What do you do with some of these guys? Are you getting anything in return for them?
It's the same as Hawthorn after 2015.
Yeah.
It's the same. I think Richmond's looking down the barrel of something a little bit similar, maybe not as pronounced with their sort of downward spiral. They've been able to get some quality class at a younger age level into their list a little bit earlier.
And that's what I've sort of liked about what Richmond and Geelong are doing it sort of this year as well. If you look at their set-about setup this year as well, again, every year, they're sort of always introduced someone into the... They've had their Selwood, Dangerfield, Tom Hawkins has been the main leaders, but they've slowly introduced into the midfield at the moment is Tanner Bruin, Max Holmes, Tom Atkins has got in there. Richmond have done it. They've introduced Thompson Dow, Hugo Ralph-Smith.
And you have to.
And they're not playing consistent games, but there's always 3 or 4 in the team that are playing each week. West Coast, you go back to 2019, 2020, and they were sticking with the same 22 most weeks. They weren't introducing just a couple of midfield, just a couple of, younger players just to come in and play with those guys. Then they got the injuries and they just had to throw in unused people just to sort of, play straight away. And I think that's one thing where I look at Geelong. I think they've constantly done that well. He's just kept introducing players to that team.
And you can kind of see how stark that is, because even on the weekend, so Connor McDonald was Hawthorn's sub. He came on, whatever point of the game it was, he had 14 disposals. He had more touches than 17 Eagles. It was just a domination. And this is what happens, I think, when you do have to throw players in.
This isn't Melbourne or Collingwood that stitched them up. This is it's an embarrassment.
So it's going to be a long slog from here. I don't think that we've possibly seen the worst. There are still veteran guys on this list that will need to retire, who are still arguably top 5, top 10 players. So it's going to be a long slog.
Yeah.
Okay, firstly, here's a question for you.
Yeah.
Does Simpson have the patience? Secondly, does West Coast as a club have the patience? Thirdly, does the media over there, ravenous, do they have the patience? And do the fans have the patience? There's 4 stakeholders here that I don't think have the patience.
Let me throw another question back at you. Excuse me.
Was that the question?
What we've seen in the last week with Alistair Clarkson stepping, I know it's a little bit different, his reason, but it is a form of burnout as well, where he is, there's so much of his mental energy is focused on something else.
Sure.
And then we see Damien Hardwick today. Does Adam Simpson look at that and think, why not me as well? Like, do you think he's more likely now than he was a week ago to kind of follow that same path?
I think, yes. And again, I don't know what he's thinking. I'm not saying it's got to put the thought into his mind, but yes, it has to make it a little bit easier just to think, okay, 2 other coaches have been able to have a press conference and move through it. Maybe I can do this without all the heat being on me. Because, maybe it was 2 weeks ago. Geez, if I pull a pin, it's going to be written stories about how I've given up and walked away from the club. Now, surely,
whereas if
he does it now, it just becomes a scary trend of the AFL. We say, we've lost another one, rather than, Adam Simpson is walking away.
But yes, and I can agree with both. I think it is a scary trend of the AFL. Maybe not scary, but it's the reality
if he was to leave next week, if we had 3 coaches in 3 weeks. Yeah.
We're never going to see a coach experience burnout when you're winning premierships. That just doesn't happen. You're going to experience the burnout, and you're going to want to leave when your team is in the bottom half of the ladder, as we've seen. But I always find it funny. Coaches get far too much credit when they win, and they get criticised far too much when they're losing. And I mean, it's got to be somewhere in the middle. Adam Simpson now's a bum. Well, he won a premiership 5 seasons ago. And he's had, as Christian said, he's had a horror run of injuries. The problem with West Coast is I think now we're at the point where even if they got all their players back, I just don't think they're as good as what they're
going to have.
They're not as good as what they were in 2018. They're not that good anymore.